Welcome to the Implementing CDBG webinar series presented by the New Hampshire Community Development Finance Authority, also known as CDFA. My name is Ed Geiger, and the topic for this module is environmental review. You can download a copy of the PowerPoint slides for this webinar from the CDFA website for your reference. Let's get started. If you want to have a successful CDBG project, proper implementation of all environmental review or ER requirements is crucial. It can make or break you. A primary theme of this webinar is that you should not spend a dime until your environmental review is completed and CDFA has signed off on the release of funds. That dime includes more than just CDBG. It includes funds from any other source supporting your project. That encompasses local funds, private funds, or even money you may have spent a couple years ago. Why is environmental review necessary? To protect public health and safety, avoid or mitigate impacts that may harm local governments and the public, to avoid or mitigate any harm to the surrounding environment and the project site, to avoid litigation that could stop the project on environmental grounds, and especially to avoid monitoring findings and/or loss or payback of HUD funding for the project. And environmental review is also necessary because it's statutorily required. This slide highlights the federal laws and regulations that impose ER requirements, the most significant of which is the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, also known as NEPA. Procedures for the environmental review process for all CDBG projects are determined by NEPA, with implementing regulations from the Council on Environmental Quality. HUD also imposes regulations at 24 CFR Part 58 that give instructions on how to implement NEPA requirements. The Part 58 requirements cover NEPA and over 12 related environmental laws and authorities. If CDBG funding is utilized for any part of the project, the entire project must adhere to these ER regulations. The National Environmental Policy Act of 1969 is the founding national charter for the protection of the environment. This law also established the Council on Environmental Quality. NEPA requires environmental values be given appropriate consideration in decision-making on the expenditure of federal funds. It ensures that environmental information is available to the public before decisions are made and before actions are taken. Citizens must have the right and opportunity to comment. Depending on the project and level of review, the amount of public comment required increases. NEPA requires a systematic, interdisciplinary approach. It helps public officials make project decisions with an understanding of environmental consequences. This slide and the next list additional NEPA-related laws and authorities which are cited in the HUD regs at Section 58.5. If projects impinge on environmental resources, the environmental standards imposed in these laws must be adhered to when utilizing CDBG funds. These laws cover environmental aspects of the landscape, water resources, animal species, and even historic preservation elements of a project. 24 CFR 58.5 says the responsible entity, or RE, which for CDBG projects is the local government, it must assume responsibility for the decision-making that apply under the specified laws and authorities. Here are the other statutes, regs, and authorities cited in HUD's ER regulations found in Section 58.5. It is also important to understand that ER procedures are not the same for all federal agencies. HUD imposes additional criteria on its projects that CDBG grantees must consider even though other agencies such as USDA Rural Development or the Economic Development Administration do not impose. These additional HUD-mandated environmental criteria and standards are cited at Section 58.5I and explained in 24 CFR Part 51. Section 104G of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974 authorizes the HUD Secretary to allow units of general local government and states to assume the status of the federal official under NEPA and NEPA-related environmental laws and authorities. The local government then performs the required environmental reviews. This assumption authority allows cities, counties, and states to act as the responsible entity, also called RE, in lieu of HUD for the purposes of NEPA environmental review, decision-making, and action. Note, CDFA, like nearly every other state in the country, delegates this responsibility to local governments for CDBG. CDFA is not the responsible entity, which is a different process than what the New Hampshire Housing Finance Agency uses. NEFA does the environmental review process for its housing projects rather than the local grantee. 24 CFR 58.4 specifies that states shall act as HUD and devise a review and approval process of local government submissions required under environmental review. 24 CFR 58.5 says that the responsible entity must assume responsibility for the decision-making that applies under the specified laws and authorities listed on the previous two slides. As referenced in 24 CFR Section 58.71, a responsible entity's certifying officer, in other words, the local government official who signs certification, serves as the responsible federal official, fulfilling the requirements of that position as referenced in Section 102 of NEPA. The certifying officer is therefore responsible for all environmental review documents that the local government grantee must sign and submit to CDFA to fulfill the environmental review requirements of NEPA and the related provisions. The authorized official, or AO, assumes the responsibility of Environmental Certifying Officer, or ECO. Regional Planning Commission staff and outside consultants or subrecipient grant administrators may assist the responsible entity in the preparation of an environmental review. However, the responsible entity, in this case the AO, is required to independently evaluate the information and is solely responsible for its accuracy. The AO or local government has an option to formally delegate signature responsibility to someone else as the environmental certifying officer. This delegated individual who signs the environmental review forms and certifications must be another local government official or an employee of the local government, not an outside entity or consultant. All of that being said, the person who's managing all of these processes, generally the local grant administrator, must have a good understanding of the environmental review requirements, so that when the AO or the person delegated as the environmental certifying officer is signing the environmental review documents, the grant administrator can confirm to the person signing the validity and compliance of those actions, and is capable to answer questions about what the ECO is certifying. The ECO, signing the required certifications and notices, also represents the local government in federal court. And in this process, there is no passing the buck to someone other than the responsible entity. The grant administrator should be able to support the environmental certifying officer in this process. The first requirement to understand for the ER process is the importance of avoiding choice-limiting action. The local government grantee and all other participants in a CDBG project, including other public entities, nonprofit agencies, or for-profit developers, or any of their contractors, cannot commit HUD or non-HUD funds if an activity would have an adverse environmental impact or limit the choice of reasonable alternatives. If the responsible entity is aware that a subrecipient, developer, or beneficiary is about to take action that would limit alternatives or choice-limiting actions, the responsible entity must take appropriate action to defer those actions to ensure that NEPA and related laws are reviewed and followed before choice-limiting decisions are made. Examples of choice-limiting actions include acquisition, leasing, rehabilitation or construction, and site improvements, including demolition and site clearance. Do not spend a dime on choice-limiting activities until you have completed the applicable environmental review process. Any approval to do so will limit the choices and options that can be considered in the environmental review process. More than just expenditures, you cannot commit formally or informally to fund such choice-limiting actions before completing the ER process. Further, and just as important, projects considered subject to Section 58.5 and projects requiring an environmental assessment must first receive authorization to use grant funds from CDFA. Until CDFA approves, you do not have clearance to proceed with your project. It doesn't matter if you plan to use CDBG funds or other funds. Once an application for CDBG funds has been made for a project, commitment of HUD or even non-HUD funds prior to approval of the environmental review inherently diminishes and biases objective consideration of alternative locations for the proposed project, including a no-action alternative. Other funds include both public and private funds. HUD requires consideration of alternatives as fundamental to the environmental review process. Considerations of alternatives is the heart of NEPA. Option agreements are allowed on a proposed site or property prior to completion of environmental review if the option agreement is subject to the grantee's desirability as a result of the environmental review process and the cost of the option is a nominal portion of the purchase price. Conditional contracts are also permitted if they meet HUD standards that do not financially bind project funds until the ER process is complete. Sales agreement or contract does not qualify and is not considered the same as a real estate options agreement. Home buyer agreements must also be structured as conditional contracts, not as sales agreements, until the ER process is complete. You should start the environmental review process as soon as you have identified the scope of the project and the project area. It is important to determine early on which level of review or category of environmental review will be needed for the activities in the project. The amount of time for the environmental review can take anywhere from 1 day up to 3 to 4 months or longer, depending on the project. If a project is exempt or categorically excluded from NEPA-related laws and authorities, it may take only 1 day to process the review and document the exemption. However, with other types of projects and higher levels of environmental review, the review time can take 3 to 4 months, depending on the project and the environmental notices requesting public comment. If comments are received, the RE must consider the comments and respond in writing to the commenter whenever the environmental issues and objections are related to compliance with environmental procedures. Again, the local government, as well as any subrecipient or entity participating in a CDBG project, may not commit HUD funds or any other funds on an activity prior to completing the ER process, which for some ER categories is not until CDFA approves and issues the authority to use grant funds for. This slide and the next provides a very summarized list of the steps in the ER process. The specific steps will vary slightly based on the project and required level of review. Make particular note that the environmental review record must start early and be made available to the public throughout the course of the review. We will be reviewing more details on each step on this slide and the next. HUD regs, specifically Section 58.38, require that the RE maintain a written record of the environmental review undertaken for each project. The environmental review record, also known as ERR, is to be available for the public review throughout the environmental review process and the entire project. That requirement does not end once the public comment period is over. The ERR may be posted on the responsible entity's website. Again, these two slides and the information provided in this webinar just summarize the ER process. We will not cover the full details in every required substep. A complete training on environmental review is at least a full day, if not multi-day course. At this point, let's continue on to cover some additional explanation of the steps shown in these two slides. Once you have a CDBG award, you need to identify who will manage the environmental review process. This manager is different from the environmental certifying officer or ECO. This person will serve as the point of contact and be undertaking the technical review requirements. This person does not have to be a local government official or staff person. Commonly used options for someone to manage the ER process are an existing local government staff person, the city planner, someone on the regional planning commission staff, a grant administrator, licensed engineer, or other planners, architects, and private consultants. Most importantly, it should be someone with experience with the process and laws. Remember, if you're paying for this person as a contractor or consultant using CDBG funds, you must follow the procurement process. The local government's authorized official serves as the environmental certifying officer, ECO, unless someone else is officially designated. If desired, the AO can delegate this responsibility to someone else. In order to delegate another person, the local government needs an ordinance or signed resolution formally designating that other person, who must be a local government official or local government employee. This delegation of ECO must be via an official action such as the resolution or ordinance. The resolution or ordinance is required because the certifying officer assumes responsibility to sign and certify to the environmental review process on behalf of the local government. As a recommendation, if the ER process will be managed by another entity or private contractor, local government should consider identifying someone on the local government staff who's familiar with the ER process to serve as staff support for whoever will serve as the ECO, particularly if the AO or even a town manager who has limited time to focus on ER requirements is the ECO. These officials may need someone to become knowledgeable enough to consult and advise when that certifying officer is signing the environmental review findings, notices, and certifications. Remember, the responsible entity is solely accountable should environmental issues arise, while an outside entity assigned to manage ER responsibilities can serve as a public spokesperson for that process. The local government, as responsible entity, is liable if the ER process is not properly completed. The next step, also at the outset of the ER process, should be a full and accurate description of the project. Successful compliance requires that you assemble the details, including scope of the project, all activities that are included in the project, exact and entire location of the project, as well as detailed maps of the project area. The NEPA Assist website has an online mapping tool that can also help identify environmental resources and concerns. Defining the project for ER purposes must be comprehensive and aggregate all activities. Local grantees must group together and evaluate as a single project all individual activities that are related either geographically or functionally or are logical parts of a composite of contemplated action. Keep in mind, project phasing is not allowed when the purpose of phasing is an attempt to avoid environmental review. For example, say a business is building a plant and the local government is doing infrastructure in support of job creation. While CDBG is paying for the sewer lines, you must include the whole project area, including where the plant is, and that business site must be addressed in the ER also. If part of the project might be deemed categorically excluded and part might not, the whole thing has to be reviewed with the higher level as if the project is not categorically excluded. As stated earlier, it is important to initiate and maintain the environmental review record throughout the life of the project and grant agreement. The record must be available for public inspection and comment at the municipality's office, not just with the consultant or at the subrecipient's office. The ERR is a written record of all environmental compliance documentation accumulated during the ER process, such as photographs, site plans, reports, studies, mitigation measures required and completed, written determinations, findings, public notices, etc. Also, the ERR includes all written comments and objections received relating to the environmental issues. Also include copies of the responsible entity's written responses to respondents. The ERR is the responsible entity's proof of compliance with federal environmental law and your defense against environmental challenges. To reduce exposure to legal liability, carefully document compliance with NEPA and all related laws. Be thorough, be responsible, and be thoughtful. The ERR is not a personal file that you can fill out after the fact. Additionally, very early on in the ER process, you need to determine the level of environmental review required. That level is organized into essentially 5 categories of review, 2 of which are categorically excluded. This slide lists those 5 categories in the order from least to highest level of review. The slides that will follow provide more detail about each category, again in that same order from lowest to highest level of review. Starting now with the lowest level of review, exempt activities. Typically, exempt activities include administration of CDBG funds, environmental assessment or studies, planning or management, engineering or architectural design, and inspection. Exempt activities are defined at Section 58.34 of the HUD Regs. Even exempt activities require environmental review and documentation before proceeding. We will cover the review process after discussing all the categories of review. Under categorically excluded, there are 2 classes of activities. These are named excluded because they are excluded from certain NEPA requirements, but not all federal laws and environmental requirements. These 2 categories are often shorted to excluded, not subject to, or excluded subject to, or just simply not subject to and subject to. Their acronyms are CENST for not subject to and CEST for subject to. Not subject to activities generally include working capital or equipment in economic development projects, activities that assist home buyers, operating costs and maintenance of community facilities or senior centers, activities that not involving construction or rehabilitation, housing pre-development and soft costs, purchase of equipment with minimal installation, and most public services. These activities are defined in Section 58.35b. Subject to activities generally start to have physical impacts. Activities such as acquisition and leasing of existing buildings, removal of barriers in ADA projects, or acquisition of land or buildings retained for the same use. Other subject to activities include repair, improvement, reconstruction, or rehabilitation of public facilities and improvements when those facilities and structures will be retained in the same use, with any change in size or capacity limited to 20% or less. Also, subject to includes housing and non-residential rehab, business facades, acquisition, including leasing, or disposition of an existing structure or vacant land, provided that the structure or land will be retained for the same use. These activities are defined in Section 58.35a. The regulatory definition should always be used to confirm which category is applicable for your project. The next category of review is environmental assessment, or EA. If a project is not exempt or categorically excluded, the responsible entity must prepare an environmental assessment. An EA level of review occurs by default. There is no regulatory definition of what activities fall under this category. If your activity does not meet the test of any of the other 3 categories, it requires an environmental assessment. Many CDBG approved and funded projects require an EA. Some examples include new water and sewer lines, building more than 4 units of housing, most new construction, as well as major rehab of housing and other residential or non-residential buildings. Finally, environmental impact statements, the highest level of review, are required when a project is determined to have a potentially significant impact on the environment. It is important to note that the size of the project alone does not determine significance. The nature of the impact does. The environmental impact analysis is not limited to the potential impact of the HUD-assisted activity. It examines the site and surrounding area and must consider the potential impact from the entire scope of the area potentially affected by the project activity. You very rarely see environmental impact statements for CDBG projects. Environmental impact statements are required for projects like a new airport, dam, or train station. These projects are seldom funded with state-awarded CDBG funds. Most rural areas and small towns do not undertake projects of this magnitude with CDBG. Environmental impact statements are specifically required if the project would provide for or result in the construction of hospitals or nursing homes containing a total of 2,500 or more beds. The project would remove, demolish, construct, or convert or substantially rehab 2,500 or more housing units. The project would provide enough additional water or sewer service to support 25 more housing units. 40 CFR Section 1501.4 provides additional guidance on the activities that would trigger an environmental impact statement. If you encounter a project that may require an EIS, you should consult with CDFA before proceeding with your application or project. After determining the level of review, the next series of slides provides a brief overview of the ER process for the 4 primary categories of environmental review. The following summary of this process will emphasize the key steps that the ECO and grantees should be aware of. This presentation will not be an in-depth training of the ER process containing all the technical details. We will cover the 4 categories in the order from lowest to highest level of review, starting with exempt activities. For this lowest level of review, complete the environmental review for exempt activities form. This form includes certifications required by Section 58.6. This Section 58.6 review is required for all levels of activities, including exempt. That review must certify that the activities will not have an impact on 3 aspects of the environment. First, the National Flood Insurance Program. The Section 58.6 criterion, though, is not applicable to CDBG. There are other flood and wetland provisions I will summarize later, but the Section 58.6 review step is not applicable to CDBG activities. The second point is the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. However, since no coastal barriers exist in New Hampshire, this second criterion is also not applicable for CDFA projects. Finally, airport runway clear zones. Grantees need to determine whether the project has proximity to an airport runway and potential notification that must be provided to anyone impacted by these activities. The certifying officer must sign and send the certification to CDFA. Note, as we addressed earlier, only the authorized official or formally designated local government official can serve as the certifying officer, not the subrecipient or a consultant or other private contractor. Once the exempt form is sent to CDFA, the environmental review is complete. You can commence activities. You do not need to wait for any approval from CDFA. Note, HUD reviews CDFA to ensure compliance, so the state needs this form and information. Be certain it is complete and submitted to CDFA, particularly remembering that you need to submit this certification even to commence admin costs for your project. The next level of review is categorically excluded, not subject to, Section 58.5, or also known as categorically excluded, not subject to. This level of review works much like exempt. CDFA is providing a separate checklist for not subject to activities. Previously, there was a combined exempt and not subject to form. In order to facilitate review and documentation, these 2 forms are now separate. The form contains the same Section 58.6 checklist as in the exempt form. Again, only the airport runways criterion needs to be reviewed. Just like exempt, have the ECO sign the not subject to certification and send it to CDFA, and you may commence activity. CDFA does not need to send you an approval in order to proceed with not subject to activity. The next level of review, categorically excluded subject to activities, begin to impose more significant review requirements. CDFA now has a separate review form for subject to and environmental assessment activities. Conduct the environmental review process using the subject to form. Grantees must complete a detailed project description, the checklist for Section 58.6 criteria, which, like exempt and not subject to activities, requires review of the airport runway criterion, and the grantee must complete the statutory checklist. This list covers 14 environmental requirements imposed by statute, regulation, or executive order. At this stage, you very much want an environmental review manager in place with expertise to assist in completing the ER process and confirming how the activities conform to that statutory checklist. In confirming the statutory checklist for the ECO, be certain all results are documented with sources that are credible. Check websites and third-party verification. Note that the floodplain and wetlands conditions are referenced in the statutory checklist and, if present, require additional review steps. 24 CFR Part 55 explains the 8-step process, and we will review that process separately because it is frequently encountered in CDBG projects. For historic review, also called the Section 106 process, submit the request to the State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, for a concurrence letter. This step is part of the statutory checklist, and we will be highlighting it separately because it is also a frequent issue encountered in CDBG projects. After completing the Section 58.6 checklist and statutory checklist, if the project does not require any mitigation for compliance with any listed statutes or authorities, nor requires any formal permit or license, the activity now converts to exempt status. Proceed ahead like an exempt project by sending the certification form to CDFA, and you can commence with your activity. You do not need to wait for CDFA approval. However, if the activities do not convert to exempt, the grantee must proceed with publication and public notice and must wait for CDFA approval. Publish the Notice of Intent and Request for Release of Funds, or NOI-RROF. This published notice requires a 7-day comment period. The implementation guide contains specific requirements on the publication of the NOI as well as an example notice. A combined notice may be necessary if wetlands or floodplains are impacted. If no public comments are received in the 7-day period, or once the grantee responds to any comments and concerns, the grantee can submit the request for release of funds to CDFA. Wait for CDFA to return the authority to use grant funds form. CDFA will allow 15 days for objections or public comments. The 15 days begins when CDFA receives your request, not when you sent it. Once you receive the authority to use grant funds, your ER is complete. Activities can commence. Note, all time periods for notices must be counted in calendar days. The first day of a time period begins on the day following the publication of the notice. Do not count the day the notice is published. The next level of review is an environmental assessment. Perform the ER process using the Determination of Environmental Assessment form. In that form, the grantee must complete a detailed project description, the checklist for Section 58.6 criteria, which, like exempt and categorically excluded activities, is just the review of the airport runway criterion, and the grantee must complete the statutory checklist. There is an additional environmental assessment checklist, EA checklist, that is added for this category of review. The EA checklist items include consideration of the potential impact on land development, socioeconomic factors, community facilities and services, as well as natural features. The EA checklist also requires a discussion of alternatives that are considered and mitigation measures that are adopted. If activities occur in the floodplain or wetlands as part of the 8-step decision-making process, publish the early public notice in a non-legal section of the newspaper of general circulation. A 15-day comment period begins after the publication of the floodplain or wetland notice. Consider and respond to any comment. Like subject to activities, be sure to submit for historic review with the SHPO. After completing the determination of environmental assessment form, providing opportunity for comment and reviews by interested parties, the responsible entity must determine whether there is any significant impact on the environment for the project. If there is none, publish a combined notice that includes your finding of no significant impact, or FONSI, spelled F-O-N-S-I, and the notice of intent, request for release of funds. If applicable to your project, you may also publish the final notice of explanation for decision to locate a project in the floodplain that is combined with your publication of the FONSI and notice of intent. Combined FONSI, notice of intent, request for release of funds, floodplain notices have a 15-day comment period. Again, consider and respond to all comments received. Then you may submit the request for release of funds to CDFA along with your EA certification and all other required documentation. Wait for CDFA to return the authority to use grant funds. Remember, the 15 days begins when CDFA receives the request. Generally, the basis for objections during the 15-day comment period are for non-compliance with any procedure required by the ER regulations in Part 58. Those objections include failures such as the certification was not signed by the ECO, or omission of one or more steps in the preparation or notice of an EA, or committing funds prior to receiving authorization to use funds from CDFA. Once the authority to use grant funds form is received, your ER is complete. Activities can commence. The final category of activities is the environmental impact statement. If the result of your environmental assessment is that you have a finding of significant impact instead of no significant impact, you must complete an environmental impact statement. If you have such a finding or determine your project requires an environmental impact statement level of review at the outset of your ER process, contact CDFA staff to discuss possible means of mitigation and/or project modification. We will not be reviewing the steps in the environmental impact statement process because of how rarely it occurs. The regulatory requirements for such reviews can be found at 40 CFR Parts 1500 to 1508 and 24 CFR 58 Subpart G. At this point, I want to highlight 2 items that are part of the statutory checklist for subject to and environmental assessment reviews because grantees commonly have project issues to address in the ER process. Those items are historic preservation and the floodplain wetlands requirements. Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act imposes a review by the State Historic Preservation Office, also called SHPO. Start the Section 106 process as early as feasible. Ideally, you want to obtain a concurrence letter or letter of no adverse effect. The SHPO has 30 days to respond to your review request. Section 106 imposes a consultation process to identify significant historic properties and resources in the planning stage of a project so that any harm to them can be avoided or minimized. The SHPO cannot prevent a project from occurring. However, not heeding this process can thwart or violate the ER process, which would halt or result in a non-compliant ER. You should submit a request for project review or RPR form and all applicable supporting documentation to the New Hampshire Division of Historical Resources, which is the SHPO in New Hampshire. Then allow 30 days for the SHPO to respond. If a project area impacts a historic property or district It may necessitate the project incorporate historical elements into the construction. If the site is undeveloped and has not been previously disturbed, the land could contain archaeological artifacts requiring a cultural resource assessment, also called an archaeological survey. If the SHPO determines that a project affects historical resources or properties necessitating either an archaeological survey or alternative development measures, the SHPO will indicate this in a letter to the grantee. If avoidance of adverse impacts to historic property is not feasible, an agreement is made between the SHPO and the grantee through a Memorandum of Agreement. The MOA, or Memorandum of Agreement, entails agreed-upon measures to mitigate adverse effects that are implemented and documented by the grantee. CDFA staff is not responsible for negotiating the terms of the MOA. This process must be completed by you and the SHPO during the ER process before sending your certification and request for release of funds. Floodplains and wetlands are commonly encountered by CDBG projects. HUD regulations at 24 CFR Part 55 contain an 8-step process when a project is in a floodplain or impacts a wetland. If you find that your project might do either, contact CDFA staff immediately to review this 8-step process. Those steps are: 1, determine if the project area is located in a floodplain or wetland. 2, publish an early notice of proposal to allow public comment and response. A 15-day comment period is required. 3, evaluate practical alternatives to the floodplain or wetland site for the project. 4, identify direct and indirect impacts associated with the project. 5, design or modify actions to minimize adverse impacts and preserve the floodplain. 6, reevaluate whether proposed action is practical or feasible in light of flood hazards and costs of minimization. 7, publish a final notice of decision identifying why there is no practical alternative and describe mitigation measures adopted. This notice can be combined with a FONSI and NOI notice. 8, obtain approval via your request for release of funds submitted to CDFA and implement the announced action with any required mitigation. Certain activities in a floodplain or wetland can use a shortened 5-step process instead of the 8-step. Those activities include disposition of acquired multifamily or single-family property, purchase or refinancing of existing multifamily projects and residential facilities, repair, rehab, or improvement of existing residential structures not being converted from non-residential, which also do not meet the definition of substantial rehab and are not increasing the number of units more than 20%. 5 steps are also allowed for repair, rehab, or improvement of non-residential properties that do not meet the definition of substantial improvement and do not significantly increase the size. The 5 steps of the 8-step process to be used are 1, and 4 through 6, and 8. This slide wraps up this webinar with several important tips to remember. Be aware that if you change the scope of your project, such as location, size, or property use during the course of your grant contract, it can affect the level of review that is required for your project. It may require that a reevaluation is completed even if the ER process was previously completed. Environmental review or approvals from other federal agencies do not supplant the ER process required by the CDBG program. HUD has different requirements that must be coordinated and completed for CDBG projects. Do not spend any money on your project until the ER is complete. And remember, for activities subject to or requiring an environmental assessment, you must first receive approval through CDFA with the receipt of the Authority to Use Grant Funds form. Any CDBG money invested in a project holds the entire project subject to the regulation, not just the parts that are being paid for with CDBG funds. Also, remember, you cannot take the project apart, create project phases or elements to avoid ER requirements. The regulatory concept of aggregation prevents that from happening. If you are unsure, keep in mind CDFA staff can help clarify requirements whenever necessary. That concludes our presentation on environmental review. Should you have any questions, please contact the CDFA Program Manager using the contact information on this slide.